Hey everybody, it's Ron, and recently I told you a story about Hoover Dam coming fully online and providing power for all of Southern California and the rest of that region. This time I want to carry that story through a little bit farther, but in a different part of the country. So this is a story about business and how that story changed everything. He wasn't panicking, and that kind of surprised him a little bit. He stood in his kitchen in Austin, Texas, wearing a coat he usually only wore outside, quietly doing math in his head. Not big math, phone battery math, generator math. How many outlets could be used at once before something tripped or failed or simply stopped responding? The list was shorter than it should have been. He unplugged the coffee maker, not because coffee didn't matter, but because it clearly mattered less than heat. He briefly considered plugging it back in again anyway, but then decided that that was a tomorrow problem, assuming tomorrow showed up. Outside, the neighborhood was silent in a way that felt unfamiliar. No hum, no background noise, just stillness, and the occasional sound of someone else making the same decisions a few houses down. By now it was obvious this wasn't a short outage. This wasn't weather plus bad luck. Whatever had gone wrong wasn't fixing itself. And as he stood there, doing calculations that no homeowner ever expects to make, the realization started to settle in. But was this just an extreme storm exposing bad luck? Or was it revealing something deeper about how the system had been built? And on February 16th, 2021, had a power market that was designed for efficiency finally ran out of room to adapt. From Business Basics, I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business History, the daily podcast where we explain stories that changed business forever. Every day of the calendar has a story where business reshaped the world. Today, February 16th, that story takes us to 2021, when the Texas power market hit its limits. Now, for this story, it's important to understand that Texas didn't stumble into this system by accident. For decades, the state had chosen to run its power grid differently than the rest of the country. While most of the rest of the United States tied into what were called interstate networks and accepted federal oversight, Texas built a largely self-contained system. The pitch for doing it that way was simple and compelling. Competition would drive prices down. Efficiency would be rewarded, and markets, not mandates, would decide how electricity got built and delivered. At the center of that system sat ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. Its job is to run Texas's power grid on a day-to-day basis. One of ERCOT's biggest responsibilities is to balance supply and demand across most of the state every single day. It operated a power market designed to reward generators for producing electricity when it was needed, not for sitting idle just in case something went wrong. And that distinction mattered. See, the market paid for energy, not for backup capacity. It assumed that scarcity pricing, higher prices during tighter conditions, would incentivize enough investment to keep the system reliable. Winterization, redundancy, and rare event preparation were optional. They weren't required. In a fast-growing city like Austin, the system looked like a success. Demand grew, new residents arrived, power was cheap and dependable and mostly invisible. The grid hummed along quietly in the background, doing exactly what it had been designed to do, until it didn't. When the cold arrived in February of 2021, it didn't just stress the system. It stressed every assumption underneath it. Generators froze, or fuel supplies failed. Transmission of the power struggled, and because everything was optimized to run lean, there was very little slack when multiple failures hit at once. By the time outages spread across Austin and beyond, the problem was no longer localized, it was systemic. As the storm tightened its grip, ERCOT faced decisions with no good options left. Power plants were dropping offline faster than replacements could come online. Demand surged as heating systems worked overtime. To prevent a total grid collapse, ERCOT ordered widespread load shedding, which was intentionally cutting power to large portions of the state. In theory, those outages were supposed to rotate. In practice, they often didn't. In Austin, entire neighborhoods went dark for days while others remained powered. Critical infrastructure took priority: hospitals, data centers, government facilities, which meant residential areas bore the brunt. What felt like randomness to people in their kitchens was actually triage happening at a much larger scale. At the same time, the market behaved exactly as it was designed. Wholesale electricity prices spiked to their cap. Scarcity pricing kicked in. Those signals said electricity was extremely valuable. Those pricing incentives arrived after the physical system had already failed, and that was the turning point. The crisis exposed the gap between economic theory and physical reality. Markets could allocate scarce electricity, but they couldn't create resilience on demand. A system built to be efficient in normal conditions had no margin left when conditions turned abnormal. And by this date in 2021, it was clear that this was not just a storm problem, it was a design problem. Now, as I'm sure you understand, power eventually returned and the lights came back on, life resumed unevenly and awkwardly and with a lot of unanswered questions. But the aftershocks, those lasted. In Austin and across Texas, businesses reevaluated assumptions they had never had questioned before. Backup generators, contracts for fuel, and contingency plans moved from, that'd be nice to have, to, that's a necessity. Data centers, manufacturers, and hospitals began treating grid power as a variable, not as a guarantee. At the policy level, investigations obviously followed. Reports pointed to the same conclusion from different angles. The system had done what it was built to do. The problem was that it had not been built to withstand. Texas faced a choice. It could double down on price-based incentives and hope rare events stayed rare, or it could acknowledge that resilience costs money and that someone has to be paid to provide that resilience. This episode didn't mark the end of market-based power systems, but it did mark the end of pretending that efficiency alone was enough. By February 16, 2021, the limits of optimization had been exposed, not by ideology, but by the reality of a winter storm in Texas. I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business History, the podcast that finds the turning points behind the headlines. To hear more stories like this, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen. And if you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to subscribe and leave a quick review. It helps more people find the story behind the business. And if you want to actually understand business better without the fluff or the buzzwords or the BS, start by visiting us at businessdailypodcast.com.